Welcome to the 700 Club. Regrettably, the President of the United States does not tell the truth to American people. Let's start with this one. Quote, "We're going to stay until we get them all out." Close quote. That was the President's promise to American citizens in Afghanistan just 2 weeks ago. Did he keep that promise? The Pentagon says no, and we'll all say no, and the American people realize whenever he speaks, he's lying. And although the U.S. military met its evacuation deadline yesterday, reports that at least 250 and maybe hundreds more Americans are going to be left behind, and the Taliban is in control. They will be hostages. CBN's George Thomas has the story on the pullout and what lies ahead in Afghanistan.
19 years, 10 months, and 23 days after the U.S. mission in Afghanistan began, Major General Chris Donahue, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, was the last American soldier to leave Afghan soil shortly before midnight in Kabul on Monday.
Tonight's withdrawal signifies both the end of the military component of the evacuation, but also the end of the nearly 20-year mission that began in Afghanistan shortly after September 11, 2001.
A mission that was not cheap.
The cost was 2,461 U.S. service members and civilians killed, and more than 20,000 who were injured.
By early Tuesday morning, the Taliban's Islamic fighters, along with their top leaders, were strolling the tarmac of Kabul's airport in full control and declaring that the myth of American invincibility had been busted in Afghanistan.
We have achieved our independence, and we were able to force the Americans to leave after 20 years of jihad and sacrifice.
Over 18 days, the U.S. military airlifted about 123,000 civilians from the airport, including 6,000 Americans, in the largest non-combatant evacuation in U.S. Army history. Still, U.S. citizens who wanted to get out are still trapped inside, along with thousands of Afghan partners.
There are still a small number of Americans, under 200 and likely closer to 100, who remain in Afghanistan and want to leave.
But just 2 weeks ago, in an interview with ABC News' George Stephanopoulos, the president promised to stay until every American, including Afghan allies and their families, were out.
If there's American citizens left, we're going to stay till we get them all out.
Now, with U.S. forces out, the question is, will Afghanistan become a terrorist safe haven again? The Taliban says it will not allow the country to be a launching pad for terror attacks, but many experts believe their takeover is a boost for terror groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
And unfortunately, going to see a massive boost in terror recruitment and radicalization based on the belief that jihadists in Afghanistan first defeated the Soviet Union, and now they defeated the United States.
And the ramifications are already reverberating, especially for Afghanistan's religious minority groups. At a safe house in Kabul, Jayuddin, not his real name, has been in hiding along with 12 other Afghans since the Taliban seized control of the city nearly 3 weeks ago.
One of us is always awake during the night, always walking around and praying. So if the Taliban should come and knock on our door, we should alert everyone.
In an exclusive interview with CBN News, Jayuddin and the others, who are part of Afghanistan's very small Christian community, told us they have no passports, no U.S. government-issued exit papers, and right now see their hopes of escape diminish.
We had many plans for preaching the gospel with other brothers and sisters, but then the Taliban took control so quickly. It happened so fast.
And now they've been marked by the Taliban.
Every day I receive a phone call from a private number, and the person warns me that if he sees me again, he will behead me.
While Jayuddin says he's not afraid of dying, he's asking the world to pray for his country.
We are praying for each other that the Lord would put his angels around our house for our protection and safety.
Address the nation this afternoon on the pullout from Afghanistan. Pat?
George, the greatest concern we have now is Afghanistan becoming a terror base. Tell us about these other Islamic groups in the country and their relationship with the Taliban.
Yeah, Pat, there are several terrorist groups that are operating right now as we speak in Afghanistan. But the intelligence community is concerned, very concerned, with three. Number one, Al-Qaeda. Number two, a group known as ISKP, it stands for Islamic State of the Khorasan Province. And number three, the Haqqani Network. Let me begin with Al-Qaeda. You know, when you hear in the news and you hear the pundits on television and, in fact, our administration say that you're going to see an Al-Qaeda resurgence, the reality, Pat, is that Al-Qaeda has always been on the ground. Sure that we have diminished their activities in the last 20 years, but they are there. In fact, just hours before the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden's chief arms supplier and his head of security made his trip to his home base in Kandahar after 20 years, landed to a hero's welcome in Afghanistan. The United Nations reports that in June, between 5,000 to 8,000 Al-Qaeda fighters, primarily from the Uzbekistan, from Chechnya, from Pakistan, poured into the region. It's a very, very big concern. Then obviously we have the ISKP. They're the ones who reportedly launched the attack last week against our U.S. forces at the Kabul airport. So these are growing threats. It's a reality. Anybody who says that Afghanistan is not going to become a hotbed for these jihadists doesn't know what's going on.
George, the president says, no worry, we've got over-the-horizon capability to hit terrorists. Is that going to be enough?
You know, it's going to be really hard, Pat, because, you know, the whole country is surrounded. It's a landlocked country. All 6 countries, we have no presence. The closest we are is in Qatar, and it takes approximately 8 to 9 hours to fly a drone there. As a former CIA operative who worked in Afghanistan on several missions told me recently, he said there is no substitute for human intelligence and boots on the ground. Pat?
George, thank you very much. Well, let's go to Chief International Correspondent Gary Lane to talk about the global impact of this disastrous pullout. Gary, what does this signal send to the rest of the world?
Well, Pat, former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan under President Obama, Ryan Crocker, calls President Biden's impatience a disaster for the world. He says the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan has created a global crisis.
Emboldened, violent Islamic radicals, the Taliban victory, the narrative of defeating the great infidel empowers radicals in Pakistan. What is happening in Afghanistan isn't going to stay in Afghanistan. This will be felt around the world.
Pat, there are a number of hotspots that we should be looking at. And as Ryan Crocker said, Pakistan, that's one that we should look at because just 1 week ago, the Pakistanis successfully tested the Fatah-1 multi-system rocket. And that has a range of about 80 to 90 miles. They could easily reach into India, their arch enemy. But in addition to that, in Pakistan, the Haqqani Network that George had mentioned, they're operating in Pakistan. They're from Pakistan. And, of course, as George mentioned, they are closely aligned with ISIS-K. As a matter of fact, the leader of ISIS-K is a former commander of the Haqqani Network. And in addition to that, there's a relationship there with the Taliban, also with Pakistani intelligence. So we need to keep an eye on Pakistan. In addition to Pakistan, how about China? China is emboldened by this U.S. Afghanistan debacle, this withdrawal debacle. And China is saying to the United States and to others, warning us, saying, look, if you take a move on Taiwan to defend Taiwan, that's a red line that you're crossing because we believe in a one China policy. Taiwan belongs to China, mainland China. And if we move to retake Taiwan, you guys stay away. But of course, the United States will not. We have already moved warships into the Taiwan Strait because they're emboldened by what has happened in Afghanistan. And the British have moved 2 warships into Japan, and those warships have F-35 fighter jets on them. So we'll have to keep an eye also on Taiwan and China.
A couple of the bad ones are Iran and North Korea. What do you think they're going to do?
Pat, you know the Middle East very well. You've traveled there a lot over the years, so have I. I've been reporting about it for more than 40 years. And Iran they have a relationship now with the Taliban. They're sending them $5 million per day in oil. And you may say, well, that isn't much, but it's likely to grow as their trade relationship expands. What are they going to do with that money? They'll send it to Hezbollah in Lebanon, also to the terrorist group, the Houthis in Yemen. But the bigger concern, of course, is their development of nuclear weapons. And President Biden, when he recently met with Naftali Bennett, the Prime Minister of Israel, said, you know, Iran will not possess a nuclear weapon on my watch. But Bennett's got to wonder, will you abandon your allies in Afghanistan? Can I really depend on you to help Israel and have Israel's back in the event that Israel has to attack Iran? Many military experts say they don't believe that Biden would do so, so it'd be left up to Israel. Can they rely on the U.S. to have their back? But also North Korea, Pat. North Korea, Kim Jong-un has resumed development and work of the Yongbyon nuclear reactor. And that is a further development of nuclear weapons there. And China will definitely rely on Kim Jong-un in the event of war in Taiwan. Would a nuclear Korean peninsula be used against any allied invasion of Taiwan? So we'll have to keep an eye on North Korea, China, Pakistan, and Iran.
Thanks, Gary. Ladies and gentlemen, do you realize what this crowd has done to our reputation as a nation? They're a bunch of incompetents, starting from the Secretary of the Treasury, talking about General Milley. He doesn't know what he's doing. They give up this Bagram Air Force Base. They turn tail and run. They let a group of 7th century fighters take over the greatest nation on earth. There's apparently no retaliation. They accepted the Taliban's deadline of when to get out. I mean, it's been a disaster. And who's being called into account? Are there any firings? They should fire the Secretary of Defense. They should fire Milley. They ought to fire some of these lower-level generals and admirals. And they certainly ought to get rid of Blinken. But none of them are facing any kind of a problem. And in terms of impeachment, it's impossible to impeach the president. It will not happen. So what do? Well, we're stuck with them. Somehow there was an election, and elections have enormous consequences. We've got to wait to the midterms, and that's a long time with this stuff happening around the world. But our nation has been turned into the laughingstock of the world because they all know, the North Koreans know, the Russians know, the Chinese know, that America is being led by a senile old man and a group of incompetents, and it's just terrible. But we elected him. I didn't, but somebody did. At least in the Electoral College, he won. Well, turning now to the devastation from Hurricane Ida, Coast Guard first responders and volunteers are racing to pluck people from their flooded homes, so far rescuing more than 800 people in one Louisiana parish alone. Meanwhile, the governor says it will take weeks to repair New Orleans' now splintered power grid, and some are thinking it may take 1 million people without power in the summer heat. I've heard estimates as high as 2 million. CBN's Jenna Browder brings us the images of the devastation and the heroic rescue efforts.
An urgent search and rescue mission after Hurricane Ida wreaked havoc on Louisiana's Gulf Coast. Entire communities underwater as boats and helicopters go from home to home to deliver the stranded.
This is one of the worst natural disasters I've ever seen in St. John.
In one parish outside New Orleans, nearly 800 people have been rescued so far.
We've been in our emergency operations center. I slept here. I will continue to sleep here, and my home's flooded. I lost my car. So we're here to do the people's work.
This video from above Grand Isle showing devastated homes. Over the hard-hit town of Laplace, homes surrounded by water. On the ground, semi-trucks toppled and cars submerged.
The rain just kept coming. It wouldn't stop coming.
At least 3 people died. That number expected to climb. More than 1 million people without power. The devastated electric grid could take weeks to repair. Water and sewage is another major concern. 18 water systems serving 255,000 people are out. Add to that COVID-19 and 2,000 people in shelters in areas with high infection rates. One official calling it a COVID nightmare. Meanwhile, CBN's Operation Blessing is preparing to move in with relief supplies and to help with cleanup.
It's been a full assessment that included discussions with local pastors about potential supply drops. Church of the King will receive supplies from Operation Blessing. We're able to get into these areas that have been impacted by Hurricane Ida.
And Pat, the storm continues to move north, dropping rain in places like central Tennessee, where, as you know, they're still recovering from flooding from last week. Pat?
Jenna, how is the power outage affecting the hospitals in New Orleans?
Well, you know, some of the larger hospitals have done pretty well. It's some of the smaller hospitals, Pat, that haven't done quite so well in this storm. Ochsner Health is Louisiana's largest hospital system, and they're reporting that so far they've had to evacuate 65 patients from 2 of their area hospitals to other healthcare facilities, and there could be more today. The good news, Pat, is all of these hospitals are operating on generators, and going into the storm, they were very prepared. They had fuel for up to 10 days heading into the storm, and more fuel trucks are expected to arrive today. Pat, they're saying really the biggest problem is actually with these healthcare hospital employees, because many of them, you know, when they go home, if they can go home, they don't have electricity. And so it's putting a real strain on these employees and healthcare workers. And Ochsner would typically put them up in hotels, but the area is without electricity. So right now, that's just really not a possibility.
Thanks, Jenna. You know, ladies and gentlemen, a few years ago, we learned that the pipes taking the wastewater out of New Orleans were compromised and leaking, and they were affecting the water supply, and all under the pipes under the city were old and decaying. And in those days, there was a real serious thought that instead of spending billions and billions of dollars to rebuild New Orleans, the smartest thing would be to locate that great city and move it somewhat north, that would be out of the flood zone and out of the tremendous problems that we had during Katrina and I've had during this hurricane. Nothing much has been done about it, but nevertheless, it should be on the table. The nice thing about this particular hurricane, if you can use that, is that the local city of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana, and the federal government have been working together hand in hand. That was not true in Katrina. They were fighting each other, and the devastation and the suffering was beyond comprehension. This one is much better, but that doesn't still relieve the fact that 1 million and possibly as many as 2 million people in the state of Louisiana are without electric power and will be that way for some time in the midst of this heat.